Welcome to Stories for Sleep, a place where stories are told more slowly, so that you not only listen but also feel and gently drift into sleep. Tonight, we will explore a mystery that is rarely spoken of. Before Greece, there once existed a civilization that dominated Europe and then almost completely disappeared from history. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, what is forgotten does not truly vanish. It simply sinks into the unconscious, waiting to be remembered. If you are drawn to stories that are deep, gentle, and help you sleep more peacefully, you may softly subscribe to Stories for Sleep, so you do not miss the journeys to come. The night settles slowly, and as the outer world grows quiet, perhaps this is the right moment to listen to a story not about what we remember, but about what has been forgotten. We are often taught that European civilization begins with Greece, with its philosophers, its temples, its ideas that became the foundation of the modern world. But if you pause for a moment and look more deeply, you may begin to sense that this is only a very small part of the picture, a surface layer, floating above a much deeper ocean of memory. Before Greece, there was another civilization, a civilization that was developed, widely connected, and once stood at the center of an ancient world, and yet strangely, we know almost nothing about them. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what they thought, and we can barely hear their voice in history. According to Jung, what is forgotten does not disappear. It descends into deeper layers of the unconscious, where it continues to exist quietly, influencing the present without our awareness. So what happened to this civilization? How could a world once so vibrant fade from human memory? And more importantly, did they truly vanish, or do they still exist in another form, hidden beneath the stories we continue to tell each day? On tonight's journey, you will not only explore a lost civilization, you will gently touch something deeper, the way history is remembered and the way it is forgotten. Let your mind slow down and step into this story as if entering a dream where the past still whispers, if you know how to listen. The illusion of civilization's beginning. We often believe that everything begins with Greece. White marble columns, philosophers, questions about what it means to be human. All of it seems to form a beginning, a place where history truly starts. But if you pause for a moment, without rushing to believe, without rushing to accept, simply listening, a very gentle question begins to appear. Is that truly the beginning? Or is it only the first point we still remember? Because there is a very subtle difference between origin and what remains, between what once existed and what is retold, and in the space between those two, history begins to feel uncertain. From Jung's perspective, the human mind does not only remember, it also forgets, not randomly, but according to a very deep order. What is not held in consciousness does not disappear. It sinks, it hides, it becomes part of the unconscious, and there, it still exists, quietly, influencing, without needing to be named, without needing to be clearly remembered, simply being there. And if you look at history in this way, you may begin to see that what we call the beginning may not be where everything started, but rather the point where memory becomes clear enough to be told. Before Greece, before what we learn in books, there was another world, not smaller, not less developed, but different, a civilization that once flourished, that once connected, that once existed within a vast system, and yet strangely, we know almost nothing about them. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know how they saw the world. We do not know how they lived beyond scattered pus, a civilization without a voice, without its own story, only what remains, fragments, structure, images, without clear explanations. And when you stand before those fragments, a very strange feeling appears. Not a lack of information, but a gap where a story should be, but is not. And it is this very gap that makes everything feel deeper, because it does not only ask, who were they? It also asks, what happened for them to no longer be remembered? Because losing a civilization is not only losing people, it is losing the memory of them. And that is a different kind of disappearance, quieter, deeper, harder to notice. Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Until you recognize what lies in the unconscious, it will continue to influence you, and you will call it fate. If we apply this to history, perhaps forgotten civilizations have not truly disappeared. They have simply become the unconscious of history, hidden beneath newer stories, hidden beneath the civilizations we remember, hidden beneath the beginnings we believe to be true. And in that sense, Greece may not be the beginning, but rather the uppermost layer, a very clear layer, very beautiful, very easy to remember, but not the first. Beneath it, there may be many other layers, older, quieter, harder to reach, and one of those layers is the civilization we are about to explore, not as a lesson in history, but as a journey into what has been forgotten, what has been covered, what is still there, but no longer named. And as you step into this journey, you may begin to realize that the question is not only how did they disappear, but also what allows a civilization to be erased from human memory, because this is not an event, not a single moment, but a process, slow, silent, almost unnoticed, until there is nothing left to remember. And perhaps, as you listen to this story, you are not only exploring a lost civilization, you are touching a very deep part of how human beings remember and how we forget. And as you stay with that thought a little longer, a very unusual feeling begins to emerge. Not a lack of information, but a space where a clear story should be, but is not. No name, no voice, no written lines telling us who they were, only traces like fragments of memory that have slipped out of time. And it is this silence that makes everything deeper, because when a civilization is no longer told in its own language, its history no longer belongs to it. It begins to be rewritten by those who came later, by different systems, by perspectives no longer whole. As Jung described the human mind, what is pushed into the unconscious does not lose its power. On the contrary, precisely because it is not clearly recognized, it influences more deeply in ways we do not easily see. And if history moves in a similar way, then perhaps forgotten civilizations do not truly disappear. They simply stop being named, stop being seen. Yet they remain within the structures of later civilizations, within symbols, within stories that have been transformed. Perhaps part of the world we live in is built upon things we no longer remember. And this leads to a deeper, quieter question. If a civilization can vanish from human memory, what assures us that what we call a beginning is not merely what remains? Perhaps history is not a straight line with a clear starting point, but a surface of water where only a small part rises reflecting light, and beneath it is a vast depth, silent, waiting to be touched. Introducing the minor ones, the people without a name. If you continue to step deeper into that space of history, you will begin to encounter them, not through a clear name, not through a complete story, but through traces, very quiet ones. They lived on an island in the sea, Crete, around 2000 BCE, a place not too large, yet positioned precisely at the crossroads of ancient routes, where land and sea meet, where different civilizations pass through, leaving marks and then moving on. And there, they existed. They developed. They connected. They created a world of their own. And yet, strangely, we do not know what they called themselves. The name we use, Minoan, was not given by them. It came much later when others tried to understand them. It was derived from King Minos, a figure from Greek mythology, a symbolic name, but not necessarily one that ever existed in the way we imagine. And here, something very subtle begins to appear. We are calling them by a name they may never have used, a civilization, known, yet without a true identity. From Jung's perspective, a name is not just a label. It is part of consciousness, the way an individual or a collective recognizes itself. When something has no name or loses its name, it begins to drift, not completely gone, but no longer anchored in awareness. And perhaps this is what happened to them. They did not vanish all at once. They were not erased in a single clear moment. But slowly, their name was no longer spoken. Their language was no longer understood. Their voice was no longer heard. And when a civilization loses the ability to name itself, it begins to be defined by others, by those who come after, by stories no longer whole, by systems that no longer belong to it. Minoan, therefore, is not an original name, but an attempt to fill a space, an effort to give form to something that has faded. And if you pause for a moment, you may feel something very deep, a civilization, once clearly alive, now existing only as a trace, without its own voice, without its own story, without a we to say who they were. Jung once said, identity is the continuity of consciousness. And when that continuity is broken, identity begins to dissolve. What remains is not the people, but fragments of memory. And if you look more deeply, you may begin to see that this does not belong only to history. It also exists within you. There are parts of you that were once very clear, that once had names, that once had form. But over time, they fade. They do not disappear, but they are no longer named, no longer recognized, and slowly they become part of the unconscious, hidden beneath what you think you are. In this way, the Minoans are not only an ancient civilization, they are like a symbol, an image of what happens when memory is no longer held, when something exists but can no longer tell its own story. And as you remain with that feeling, a very gentle question begins to appear. Did they truly have no name? Or have we simply lost the ability to hear it? Because there is a great difference between the two. One is non-existence, the other is existence, beyond awareness. And if the second is true, then they did not disappear. They simply became silent, a very deep silence, like the ocean floor, where everything is still there, but without sound. And if you stay with that silence a little longer, you may begin to sense something very subtle, that having no name is not only a lack of information, but a state in which something exists, but is no longer held in the light of consciousness. Jung spoke of a profound idea: what is not recognized by consciousness does not vanish. It continues to exist as symbols, as influences, as unseen structures shaping the world we live in. And if you see the Minoans in this way, they are not only a forgotten civilization, They are like a shadow in history, unclear, without sharp form, yet still present, hidden beneath what came after them. Perhaps what we call Greek civilization did not begin from nothing, but was built upon an older foundation, a foundation without a name, without a voice, yet still influential, like a dream that affects your emotions, even when you do not remember its content. You only know something has happened. A feeling remains, a trace, an echo, and perhaps the Minoans exist in history in that same way, not as a clear story, but as an underlying feeling, a hidden structure, something that once shaped the world, before the world we know came into being. And if you pause here, just for a moment, you may realize something very deep, that history is not only what is written, but also what has been lost, and yet continues to exist in another form, a different kind of civilization. As you continue to move deeper into their world, something begins to become clear. They are not like what you have come to know as a civilization. There are no towering walls, like scars cutting across the land. No symbols of war, carved deeply to glorify power. No kings standing at the center, like vast shadows overshadowing everything. Instead, everything seems softer, more open, less tense. And if you listen closely, you begin to realize this is not only a difference in structure, it is a difference in the way they saw the world. In most ancient civilizations, we are familiar with Egypt, Rome, or other great empires. Power is often expressed very clearly. Walls to defend, armies to expand, kings to control. A system built on boundaries. Who is inside? Who is outside? Who is strong? Who is weak? But here, those signs are almost absent. Not because they did not know war, but perhaps they chose another way to exist, in the way Carl Gustav Jung described each culture, like each human being is shaped by the archetypes it chooses to live by. Some civilizations build their identity around the warrior. Some glorify the king. Some organize everything around centralized power. But the Minoans seem to have chosen another archetype. Not the warrior, not the conqueror, but the one who connects, the one who merges, the one who moves with the flow rather than against it. And this becomes visible in the way they shaped their world. No walls means they did not define themselves through defense. No glorification of war means conflict was not at the center. No elevation of a single ruler means power was not concentrated in oneself, a very different structure. Not a pyramid, but something more like a network. No clear peak, no absolute center, only connection. And if you pause for a moment, you may feel that this is not only a political choice, but a way of being, a way of understanding the world, not based on control, but on harmony. Jung once said, "Where love rules, there is no will to power. Where love guides, the will to power is no longer at the center." And perhaps, at some level, the Minoans lived closer to that state than other civilizations. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but at least they did not build their entire system around it. And that is what makes them different. Not stronger, not weaker, but different in kind. They were not playing by the same rules. They were not trying to win in the way other civilizations defined victory. They rewrote the rules, a way of living where connection mattered more than control, flow mattered more than boundaries, and balance mattered more than domination. And if you look even deeper, you may sense something very subtle. A system like this is very strong, but in a way that is difficult to see. because it does not show strength through force, but through its ability to sustain, to connect, to exist without breaking. Like water, it needs no walls, no weapons, yet it can move everywhere. It can shape the world itself, and perhaps that is why they endured. And perhaps that is also why they were vulnerable, because when another world emerged, a world playing by different rules, a world built on power, control, and war, a softer system may no longer have stood in the same way. And if you remain with that thought, a very gentle question appears. Was such a different civilization a step forward, or a fragile state? Or perhaps it was simply another possibility that humanity once touched and then lost. And as you stay a little longer with that image, a civilization without walls, without glorified war, without placing one individual above all, you may begin to feel something unfamiliar, that the way they existed was not only structurally different, but different in how they understood safety. For many civilizations, safety comes from clear boundaries, building higher walls, creating greater force, maintaining tighter control. But here, they seem not to have chosen that path, not because they could not, but perhaps because they did not see the world that way. Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." The way you see the world reflects how you understand yourself. And if a civilization does not build its identity around fear, around defending itself from the other, then perhaps it sees the world not as something to resist, but as a space to coexist. A very rare way of seeing, and also a fragile one, because a system not built on defense will always be vulnerable to systems built on conflict. And perhaps this was their paradox. What made them different also made them unable to endure forever when the world around them changed. But that does not make them weaker. On the contrary, it makes them more memorable, not because they conquered, but because they once existed in another way, another possibility of being human, a way of living that does not place power at the center, a way of organizing that does not rely on absolute control. And if you listen deeply, you may feel that this is not entirely unfamiliar, because somewhere within every human being, there are two tendencies: one that wants to control, one that wants to merge, one that builds walls, one that opens doors. And history may simply be the repetition of these two forces at different scales, in different forms. And the Minoans may have been one of those rare moments when the softer tendency was fully lived, before the world returned to what was more familiar. Crete, the center of the ancient world. And then, as you continue to move deeper into their world, something begins to emerge, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. They were in the right place, not by accident, not by chance, but as if the island of Crete had been placed in a very particular position among the flows of the ancient world. If you look at a map, you will see Crete between three great directions. To the north is Greece, to the east is Anatolia, to the south is Egypt. Three worlds, three civilizations, three cultural currents, and in the middle was them, not at the edge, not isolated, but at the center, a center without clear borders, yet connecting everything. And instead of building walls, they opened. Instead of defending, they moved. Instead of conquering, they connected. The sea became their path, not a boundary, but a network, a system, always in motion. Ships left their harbors, carrying olive oil, wine, textiles, metals, but not only goods, also ideas, styles, ways of living, and little by little, without war, without conquest, they began to be present everywhere, not through armies, but through influence. As Jung described, there are forms of power that do not need to impose, do not need direct control, yet still spread, like a symbol, like a pattern, like a field of influence, into which others are naturally drawn. And the Minoans seem to have understood this. Very early, they did not need to occupy land to become central. They did not need to defeat others to become important. They only needed to be within the flow and to keep that flow moving. And if you pause for a moment, you may feel this is not only a strategy, but a worldview, a world not to be controlled, but to be connected, not a collection of separate lands, but a network in constant movement. And within that network, the one who understands the flow does not need to control every point. Like water, it does not own the places it passes through, yet it touches them all. And if you listen more deeply, you begin to sense this is a very different kind of power. Not rigid, not forceful, not frightening, but the power of presence. The power of being a center, not because you stand in the middle, but because everything moves through you. Jung once said, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms. What you try to control must always be held tightly, but what you allow can become part of you." And perhaps the Minoans did not try to control the world. They let the world move through them, and in doing so, they became the center, a center without a throne, without borders, without armies, only flow. And yet, here something very subtle appears. A system based on flow is strong when the flow remains stable, but becomes fragile when the flow is disrupted. Unlike a military empire that can hold power by force, a network depends on continuity. And if something happens that breaks those connections, the entire system may begin to tremble, very gently, very slowly, but deeply. And if you stay with that feeling, you may realize that their strength was also their vulnerability, not because they were weak, but because they chose a different way of being, a way not based on control, but on connection. And in the ancient world, that was a very rare choice, and also a very delicate one. And perhaps, as you look back, you begin to see that they were not only a civilization, they were a possibility, a way humanity could organize the world without war, without domination, simply through connection. And perhaps that possibility has never completely disappeared. And as you remain a little longer with that image, an island without walls, yet becoming the center of a whole world, you may begin to feel something very deep, that a center is not always the strongest place in the usual sense, not where the largest armies are, not where the most land is controlled, not where fear is greatest, but sometimes the center is where the most connections exist, where currents meet, where everything that passes through leaves a trace. Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. What we encounter outside is part of a deeper network that connects everything." And if you see it this way, the sea is not only physical space, it is like a collective unconscious of the ancient world, where every civilization sends, and receives. And the Minoans lived within that unconscious, not separate, not outside, but immersed. They did not need to control the sea because they understood how to move within it, its rhythm, its currents, how to move with it instead of against it. And that is not only skill, but a form of awareness, a way of seeing the world, not as something to conquer, but as a living system of which you are a part. And if you pause, you may feel that this does not belong only to history. It is also true in your own life. There are times when you try to control everything, hold everything in place, shape everything to your will. And there are other times when you simply follow the flow, understand timing, and learn how to move with it. And perhaps the Minoans lived much of their lives in that state, a state not of force, but of alignment. And it is that made them the center, not because they stood in the middle, but because they were within the flow. Palaces, the machine that organized society. As you continue to move deeper into their world, the images begin to sharpen. No longer the open sea, no longer invisible currents, but structures, buildings, spaces built of stone, yet holding something greater than themselves. Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, Zacrus, names that today we call palaces. But if you listen carefully, you begin to realize they are not like what you imagine a palace to be. There is no clear throne, no trace of a supreme ruler standing above all, no structure that concentrates power in a single individual. Instead, everything feels open. Many rooms, many passageways, many interconnected spaces, like a labyrinth, but not to confine, but to operate. If you look more deeply, you begin to see these places are not places to live. They are places through which everything flows. Goods are brought in, olive oil, grain, wine, metals, stored, recorded, distributed. A system, quiet, unassuming, yet constantly active, like a living body. In the way Carl Gustav Jung understood it, every living system has a center of coordination, not to rigidly control every part, but to maintain balance within the whole. And perhaps these palaces were that center, not a center of domination, but a center of flow, where everything is gathered, organized, distributed, so that the entire system can continue. No grand commands, no imposed symbols, only a structure subtle enough to prevent chaos. And if you pause, you may feel something very deep. This is not a palace, but a machine. Not a machine of metal, but a machine of society, a system of governance, not based on force, but on organization, trust, the steady repetition of flows. And if you see it this way, you begin to understand they did not need a visible king, because the system itself became the center, not a person, but a structure, a network, a way of functioning. Jung once said, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos in all, disorder, a secret order. Within every chaos, there is hidden order." And the Minoans seem to have found that order, not by imposing it from above, but by designing a system in which order could naturally emerge. A system where everything has its place, every flow has its direction, and nothing needs to be forced for things to function, like a healthy body that does not need to command each cell, yet everything works together. And if you listen even more deeply, you may realize This is not only history, it is a very familiar image within your own mind. Inside you, there are also such palaces, places where information is stored, where experiences are organized, where emotions are processed quietly. You do not clearly see them, yet they are always working, keeping you stable, keeping you from falling into chaos. And perhaps that is why, when we look at these structures, we feel something strange. Not only curiosity, but a sense of familiarity, as if we have known this structure before, lived within such a system, not outside, but within. And if you stay with that feeling, you begin to understand that the Minoans did not merely build structures, they built a way for society to function without centralized power, a way to organize without absolute control, a way to exist without imposition. And that is a very different kind of intelligence, one that we rarely recognize, because it is not loud, not dramatic. It simply works quietly, steadily, until something causes it to stop. And as you remain a little longer with the image of these palaces, you may begin to realize they do not only organize material things, they also organize belief. Because for such a system to function, it requires more than structure. It requires trust. Trust that what is brought in will be redistributed. Trust that the system does not only take, but also returns. Trust that you are part of a whole, not separate from it. And this is a very different kind of order. Not an order based on fear, but an order based on invisible agreement. Jung once said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can only be outgrown." The greatest problems are not always solved. They are outgrown by developing a deeper structure. And perhaps the Minoans did just that. On a societal level, they did not solve conflict by controlling everything. They built a system in which conflict had less chance to arise, a system flexible enough to absorb change, stable enough to sustain flow. And if you feel this slowly, you begin to realize that their true strength was not in walls, but in the way everything was connected. A connection not clearly visible, but always present. Like within your own body, everything is functioning without your awareness. The heart continues to beat, breath continues to move, the flow continues, and you simply are there, living. The maritime trade network. As you continue to listen, everything begins to move, no longer still within stone structures, no longer confined to fixed spaces, but beginning to flow. The sea opens, not as distance, but as a pathway. Ships depart, carrying olive oil, the liquid light of the sun, wine, the ferment of earth and time, textiles soft, woven by human hands, metals heavy yet holding the power to shape the world. But if you listen more deeply, you will realize they were not only exchanging goods, they were exchanging ways of seeing the world. Each journey was not only physical, but a flow of ideas, image, symbols, technique, ways of living, all of it spreading outward from Crete to distant shores, without conquest, without imposition, only touch. As Carl Gustav Jung described the collective, unconscious, there are things that do not spread through words, but through images, through symbols, through repetition. And when enough people share the same symbols, a nexa, invisible network begins to form, something not clearly seen, but deeply felt. And the sea is where that network comes alive. Not only water, but a space of connection, a nervous system of a civilization, where information moves, where signals travel, where responses return. Like within your own body, nerves do not only transmit commands, they transmit sensation, connecting separate parts into a living whole. And the Minoans lived within that system, not outside, not controlling from above, but as part of the flow. They understood the rhythm of the sea, when to depart, when to wait, when to connect. And in that way, they did not only build a trade network, they became part of a living system, a system always moving, always adapting, always changing. And if you pause, you may realize their strength was not in what they possessed, but in what they connected. Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When two people meet, both are changed. And when two civilizations meet, the same is true. Not one directional, but mutual transformation." And the Minoans seem to have lived within that transformation, not trying to remain unchanged, not closing themselves, but opening to exchange, to change, to become part of a greater flow. And if you feel this slowly, you begin to see this is not only an economic system, but a form of consciousness, a way of being, not based on holding, but on circulation. Like breathing, if you hold it, it stops. If you let it flow, it continues. And perhaps the Minoans lived close to that rhythm, a rhythm not forced, not strained, simply flowing. And yet, here again, something subtle to appears. A system based on connection is strong, while connections remain intact but becomes fragile. When part of the network breaks, unlike a fixed structure that can stand alone, a network depends on the whole, and if one link is disrupted, the entire system may begin to tremble, very gently, very slowly, but spreading like a signal, moving through a nervous system. And if you remain with that feeling, you begin to understand that the sea was not only their source of strength, it may also have been where everything began to change. And as you remain with the image of ships, gliding slowly across the water, connecting distant lands, you may begin to feel something subtle, that this network does not only exist outside, it reflects an inner structure. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, no awareness without movement." And in the same way, a civilization is truly alive only when it does not remain still, when it allows itself to continually change, to continually exchange, to continually encounter what is different. And the Minoans lived in that state, unopened state, a state that does not fix identity into a single form, but allows identity to be shaped through interaction, through connection, through the ongoing flow of the world around it. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize this is not easy, because to remain open, you must accept that you will change, that you are not a fixed entity, but part of a process always moving. And perhaps that is what made them so unique, not because they controlled the world, but because they allowed themselves to become part of it. Soft power without war. As you continue to drift along the flow of this story, something begins to become clearer. They did not have a mighty army, no recorded conquests, no images of forces marching out from city gates, and yet their influence spread. Not loud, not imposed, but deep. Other lands began to use what they created. Styles of art, forms of decoration, images, appearing farther and farther away. Not because they were forced, but because they were chosen. And this is a very unusual kind of power. It does not come from making others afraid, but from making others want to become like you. In the way Carl Gustav Jung described, human beings are not only shaped by what is imposed from the outside, they are also drawn to symbolic images, things that touch the unconscious, things that make them feel something is right, even if they cannot explain why. And when a symbol becomes strong enough, it does not need to be transmitted through commands. It spreads on its own, repeats itself, becomes part of the world. And the Minoans seem to have created such symbols, not by trying to dominate, but by being present clearly enough, attractive enough, harmonious enough, that others were naturally drawn in. And if you pause for a moment, you may realize this is a very different kind of power. No need to control every land, no need to govern every person, only to be at the center of the network and allow everything to pass through you. And from there, influence spreads like a wave. No need to push, yet it still expands. Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Human beings are not guided purely by reason, but by what touches something deeper within. And when a civilization reaches that depth, it does not need to force anything. It is accepted, imitated, transmitted. And if you see it this way, you begin to understand that true power is not about controlling actions, but about influencing what others want to do, not forcing them, but allowing them to want. And this is a very subtle form of power, a form difficult to see, but very deep. And perhaps the Minoans lived within that kind of power, not building empires, yet becoming a center, not commanding, yet being followed, not forcing, yet being repeated. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize this does not belong only to history. It still exists in the present world. There are things you choose without knowing why, images that feel familiar even though you have never seen them before, trends that spread without anyone truly ordering them. That is how networks operate. No clear center, yet influence remains. And if you go even deeper, you may see that who controls the network is not the one standing above it, but the one who understands how it moves, understands its flow, understands how to be within it. And perhaps the Minoans understood that very early, very naturally, as if it was not a strategy, but their nature. And yet, here again, something subtle appears. A form of power not based on control remains strong as long as connection exists, but becomes fragile when what sustains it begins to change. Unlike an empire that can maintain power through force, a network depends on agreement, acceptance, repetition, and when those shift, power shifts with them very quickly, very quietly, just as it first emerged. And as you stay a little longer with the idea of this soft power, you may begin to notice something deeper, that this kind of power does not exist only between civilizations. It also exists within you. There are parts of you that do not need force, do not need control, yet still influence how you think, how you feel, how you choose, beliefs you do not remember learning, images that feel familiar without knowing why. That is how the unconscious works. It does not command, but it guides. And in that way, a civilization can continue to exist, not only through what it builds, but through what it plants in the minds of others. Jung once said, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Something small, but meaningful, can travel much farther than something vast yet empty. And perhaps the Minoans understood that in a very natural way. They did not need to build massive monuments to prove their existence. They only needed to create things with meaning, things alive enough to be remembered, subtle enough to be repeated, deep enough to touch the unconscious. And when that happens, they do not need to be there to continue existing. A strange spiritual world. As you move even deeper into their world, you begin to sense something very different. Not only in how they organized society, not only in how they connected with the world, but in how they experienced existence itself. The images that remain are not warriors, not battles, not scenes of conquest, but fish swimming quietly through water, bulls, powerful, alive, full of movement, plants, nature, soft flowing lines, as if everything were alive. And if you look long enough, you begin to feel something very unusual, that their world was not divided. There is no clear separation between humans and nature, no sense of opposition, but rather a merging. And within that world, ritual appears, not as rigid religion, but as a way of connection. The act of leaping over bulls is not merely physical. It is a moment where humans meet the power of nature, not to conquer, but to move with it. A movement between fear and trust, between control and surrender. And there, something happens, not outside, but within, in the way Carl Gustav Jung described. Symbols are not just images, they are doorways, leading into deeper layers of the mind, where humans encounter ancient archetypes, things that existed long before language. And the image of the bull, in many cultures, is not merely an animal. It is power, instinct, primordial energy. And when a human leaps over it, it is not a victory, but an encounter, a contact, a moment where humans do not stand above nature, but move with it. And then there are other images of the goddess, not gods of war, not rulers of domination, but figures of nourishment, of fertility, of protection, a very different kind of energy, softer, deeper, and perhaps closer to what Jung called the Great Mother, the archetype of life creation and the endless cycle of existence, a society that does not glorify warriors, but life, does not place power in destruction, but in sustaining, does not see the world as something to control, but something to listen to. And if you stay with that image, you may begin to feel something very deep, that this is not just another civilization, but another way to be human, a way less violent, less confrontational, closer to nature, closer to slow rhythms, cycle, unhurried movement. And perhaps that is why their world feels unfamiliar, not because it is strange, but because it is not like the world we are used to, a world where conflict is often central, where strength is measured by control. But here, everything feels softer, deeper, harder to grasp, like a dream where you do not need to fight to exist. And if you listen very gently, you may realize that somewhere within you also understands that world, not through logic, but through feeling, a very subtle feeling that humans once lived in another way, and perhaps that way has never completely disappeared. And as you remain a little longer in that world, a notary, world that does not place war at its center, does not glorify power in the usual sense, you may begin to feel something deeper still, that their way of seeing the world was not based on separation, no human on one side and nature on the other, no conqueror and the conquered, but everything as one. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. To become yourself is not to separate from the world, but to realize you have always been part of it." And perhaps the Minoans lived closer to that awareness. They did not need to define themselves through opposition, did not need to prove strength by rising above nature, because they never separated themselves from it. And if you feel this slowly, you may see this is not only a cultural trait, but a psychological state, a state where the self does not need to expand to feel it exists, where a human can be in the world without needing to control it. And perhaps that is what made them difficult to understand for the civilizations that came after. Because when you look from a system where power and control are essential, such a world seems incomplete, not strong enough, not clear enough. And perhaps that is also why their story was not fully preserved, not because they did not exist, but because they did not fit the way history was later written. A locked language, linear A. And then, as you move even deeper into their world, everything begins to grow quieter, not because there are no more traces, but because there is something still there that cannot be reached. Language. They wrote, symbols carved into clay, lines appearing on storage, tablets, clear signs that they had a system to record their world. And yet, something strange remains. We cannot read it. We do not understand what they wrote. We do not know what those symbols mean. We cannot hear their voice, even though it is still there, before our eyes. That script is called Linear A, but even that name is not theirs. Only a way for us to call something we do not understand. And if you pause for a moment, you may feel something very deep. This is not only an archaeological mystery, it is a distance between existence and understanding. They lived, they thought, they organized, they believed in something, but all of that is locked away, not because it disappeared, but because we no longer have the key. In the way Carl Gustav Jung described, language is not only a tool of communication, it is the way consciousness takes form, the way humans name the world. And when a language is no longer understood, the entire world it once described begins to fade, not vanish, but become inaccessible. Like a dream, you can no longer remember. You know it happened. You feel a trace, but you cannot name it, cannot retell it, and slowly it drifts away. Linear A is like that. It is there, clear, present, but unopened. And so, we do not know what they thought, do not know how they organized their society, do not know what they truly believed. Everything can only be guessed, from images, from structures, from what remains, but never from their own voice. And that is a very particular kind of silence. Not absence, but presence without sound. Jung once said, the word happiness would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. Things gain meaning through contrast, and perhaps consciousness can only understand through language. When language is lost, consciousness cannot reach it, and in that way, a civilization can disappear without being destroyed, only by losing the ability to be understood. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize this is not only their story, but also the story of being human. There are parts within you that you cannot name, emotions without words, memories that cannot be clearly told. They do not disappear, but they remain beyond the reach of consciousness, and in that way, they become the unconscious. The Minoans may have become the unconscious of history, no longer spoken in their own language, no longer understood in their own way, yet still existing beneath the surface, hidden in what came after, hidden in influences we do not notice. And if you stay with that thought, a very gentle question appears. Did they truly disappear? Or is it simply that we no longer know how to listen to them? And as you remain a little longer in that silence, a script that exists but cannot be read, you may begin to feel something even deeper. That language is not only how we speak, it is how we exist in the world. Jung once said, thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. When we do not understand, we tend to fill the gap with assumptions, with imagination, with stories. We create ourselves, and perhaps that is what happened to the Minoans. When their language became locked, their world did not vanish immediately, but slowly it was rewritten by others, by later civilizations, by stories no longer belonging to them. And then, they did not only lose their voice, they lost the right to define themselves. A very deep kind of loss. Not material, but identity. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize this is one of the most powerful ways a civilization can be erased. No need for destruction, no need for war, only for no one to understand them anymore. And from there, they become a space filled by other stories, other meanings, other interpretations, and perhaps that is why they seem to have disappeared, not because they no longer exist, but because we can no longer hear them in their own language. That they're a disaster, a geophysical shock, and then, after all that had been built, after stable flows, after a system that seemed to move in balance, something begins to change. Not from humans, not from war, not from ambition, but from a deeper force. A force no civilization can control. Nature, around 1600 BCE, on the island of Santorini, a volcano awakens. Not loudly at first, not clearly announced, only a build-up, a pressure gradually rising, hidden beneath the surface, like what Jung described about the unconscious. What is repressed does not disappear. It waits for a moment, and when that moment comes, and it rises, impossible to stop, impossible to control. The eruption happens so powerful that it does not only change an island, it changes the sea itself. Ash covers the sky, light is dimmed, the air shifts, and then tsunamis, walls of water spreading outward, touching distant shores, not needing to destroy everything, only to disrupt. Ships no longer sail as before. Route no longer stable. Connections begin to break. And if you remember, the strength of the Minoans was never in walls, never in armies, but in the network. And when that network is disrupted, the system begins to tremble, not collapsing immediately, not disappearing at once, but becoming fragile, very gently, very slowly, yet not fully reversible. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Every deep transformation comes with a rupture, a loss of balance, a moment when what once was stable is no longer the same. And perhaps, for the Minoans, Thera was not the end, but a shock, revealing the system's vulnerability, because a system based on connection is strong when flow is continuous, but fragile when that flow is interrupted. Unlike a fortress that can stand alone, a network needs all its parts. And when one part is affected, the whole system feels it. Like your body, when one part is hurt, the entire system responds, not collapsing immediately, but no longer the same. And if you stay with that feeling, you may begin to understand that great events do not always destroy instantly. Sometimes they simply shift the balance, making what once was stable more fragile. And from there, other changes begin to unfold, slowly, quietly, but accumulating. And if you look deeper still, you may realize this is not only the story of a civilization, but also the story of being human. There are moments in life that do not destroy you immediately, do not collapse everything at once, but leave you no longer the same. A very small shift in structure, yet enough for everything that follows to unfold differently. And perhaps Tira was that moment for them, not an ending, but the beginning of change. And as you remain a little longer with that moment, an eruption that does not immediately destroy, but transforms an entire system, you may begin to feel something very subtle, that what truly shapes history is not always visible collapse, but fracture, small structural shifts, interruptions in the flow, things not large enough to be recorded, yet deep enough to change everything. Jung once said, "Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness." No system is perfectly stable. No civilization is immune to change. And sometimes, what cannot be controlled is what shapes the direction of everything. The Minoans may never have seen an end. No clear moment when everything was known to have changed, only gradually. Fewer voyages, thinner connections, flows no longer as seamless as before. And within that change, they continued to live, to function, to exist. But the system was no longer the same. And perhaps that is the hardest thing to notice. Not collapse, but quiete transformation. Decline, a cascade of crises. And then, after that shock, nothing truly ends. There is no clear moment when their world collapses. No single day when everything stops. Instead, everything continues, but no longer as before. A very subtle shift, almost impossible to notice at first, yet enough to begin a chain reaction. Earthquakes, not once, but many times, small tremors, repeating, cracking what once felt solid, weakening the structures that once held the system steady. And then, the economy, trade routes no longer seamless, ships becoming fewer, flows slowing down, not stopping entirely, but no longer as strong as before. And within that slowing, something begins to accumulate, pressure, not from a single source, but from many directions, within, without, small instabilities, not large enough to cause immediate collapse, but enough to unbalance the system, in the way Carl Gustav Jung described, a system where the mind or society always seeks stability, but when too many elements drift out of alignment, that stability cannot be maintained forever, not because of one single cause, but because of accumulation. And that is the hardest thing to see. No single enemy, no single main cause, only many small things happening together, acting together, making the system more fragile. And if you pause for a moment, you may realize this is not a collapse. It is a process of dissolution, slow, quiet, almost impossible to name. Jung once said, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." When a system does not directly face change, it does not stop at once, but begins to distort. And perhaps the Minoans experienced this. No clear moment when they realized everything had changed. Only gradually, what once flowed easily became more difficult. What once felt stable became uncertain. What once was connected became fragmented. And within that process, they still existed, still lived, still continued. But the system was changing. And if you feel this slowly, you may see that true dissolution is not disappearance. It is the loss of coherence, the loss of synchronization, the loss of the ability to function as a whole, like a body, when its systems no longer coordinate, not dying immediately, but no longer healthy. And over time, that weakening accumulates, spreads, and becomes a new state, a state where everything still exists, but no longer as before. And if you go deeper still, you may realize this is not only the story of a civilization, it is a pattern, a way that all systems gradually change, not through a single shock, but through many small shifts, accumulating over time. And perhaps that is why there is no clear ending moment, because nothing truly ends. It simply becomes something else. And as you remain a little longer with this process of dissolution, a weakening without sound, without a clear beginning, without a clear end, you may begin to feel something very deep. That true change rarely happens the way we expect, not as a great collapse, not as a dramatic moment, but as a series of very small things, things easily overlooked, things not important enough to be recorded, yet enough to change everything. Jung once said, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it." A system can only adapt when it recognizes change, but when changes are too small, too slow, they may not be seen in time. And then, the weakening is not confronted. It simply continues, quietly, and perhaps the Minoans lived within that very process, not realizing that their system was slowly losing balance, not realizing that connections were weakening, not realizing that what once held everything together was gently coming apart, and over time that became normal, a new normal, not as strong as before, yet still enough to continue, until something else appears, another force, another system, ready to take its place, the Mycenaeans, the successors. And as the old system grows, fragile, as connections are no longer seamless, something new begins to emerge, not like a storm, not like a loud invasion, but like another wave, quietly moving in. From the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans, they are not like the Minoans, not soft, not flow-based, but more defined, more rigid, more centralized. They carry a different way of seeing the world, a world where boundaries are clear, where walls are built, where power is concentrated, where kings stand at the center, not as part of the system, but as those who control it. And when they arrive, they do not destroy everything, do not burn it all, do not erase every trace. Instead, they take over. Kinosus remains. Structures still stand, the palaces still exist, but within, everything begins to change. Not in form, but in meaning, in the way Carl Gustav Jung described. When a symbol is placed within a different system of meaning, it is no longer the same. It keeps its shape, but carries a new meaning, and that is how a system can be replaced without being destroyed. The Mycenaeans bring their language, Linear B, a script that we can read, a system clearer, closer to what we call history. And as Linear B appears, Linear A begins to fade, not immediately, but gradually, like a voice being drowned out, no longer used, no longer understood, and over time, no longer existing. And here, something very deep happens. Not only a change of language, but a change in how the world is described, how reality is recorded, how history is formed. Jung once said, man is not what he thinks he is what? A hids. A system is not only defined by what it shows, but also by what it conceals. And when a new civilization rewrites the language, they do not only record the world, they redefine what is worth remembering, what matters, what has meaning. And in that way, the Minoans do not completely disappear. They are absorbed, transformed, rewritten within another system. What remains is no longer intact, no longer pure, but a changed version, like a dream, retold in someone else's language. Still the same dream, but no longer as it once was. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize this replacement is not an event, but a process where the old is not erased, but covered, redefined, dissolved within the new. And perhaps this is how many things never truly disappear. They simply become part of another story. And as you remain a little longer with that process of replacement, a change that is quiet, not fully destructive, you may begin to feel something very deep. That true power is not always in erasing the old, but in redefining it. Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When something is no longer clearly understood, it does not disappear. It becomes part of the unconscious, and from there, it still influences, but in another way. The Minoans, after being replaced, no longer exist as an independent civilization, but they do not completely vanish. They exist in what remains, in structures still standing, in symbols still used, but with different meanings, in what was not erased, but no longer understood as before. And in that way, they become a deeper layer, a foundation, something no longer on the surface, yet still present beneath. And perhaps this is how many things in life continue to exist, not as what they once were, but as what they have become after being rewritten, rewriting history. When enough time has passed, when what once was reality is no longer remembered as itself, something else begins to happen. The story, not their story, but the story told about them. The Greeks came later. They looked back at what remained: great structures, complex spaces, architectures unlike their own world, and they interpreted in the way humans always do. When faced with something they cannot fully understand, they retold it. The Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, living in a labyrinth, a place of complexity, filled with corridors, with no escape. And at the center, there is a monster. If you pause for a moment, you may feel something very strange, because what they described may not have been entirely imagined, but rather another way of understanding what they saw, in the way Carl Gustav Jung described. When consciousness cannot grasp something directly, it transforms it into symbols, into images, into stories. And those symbols are not wrong. They are simply no longer precise. They reflect how the storyteller understands the world, not how that world truly was. And in that way, the Minoans begin to change, no longer a civilization, but becoming a myth, a story, something between reality and imagination. Their palaces become labyrinths, not because they changed, but because the way they were seen changed. Their bull rituals become images of monsters, not because that was their nature, but because they were no longer understood in their original context. And then something very subtle happens. They are not only misunderstood, they are placed into a different role, no longer the center, but a supporting element, a side story, something to be explained within someone else's world. Jung once said myths are original revelations of the pre-conscious psyche. Myths are not just imagination. They are how the mind interprets what it cannot directly understand. And when the Greeks told the story of the Minotaur, they were not only telling a story, they were unconsciously processing a civilization that existed before them. Something too different, too complex, too difficult to grasp. And so, it became a labyrinth, something to be conquered, something to be explained, by turning it into the other, into a monster, into something to overcome. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize this is not only the story of history, but the way humans always face the unknown. We retell it, we simplify it, we turn what we do not understand into familiar images so that we can feel that we understand. But in that process, we also change the story. And perhaps that is how the Minoans truly disappeared, not because they no longer existed, but because they were no longer told in their own way. And as you remain a little longer with those stories, Minotaur, Labyrinth, King Minos, you may begin to feel something very deep. That myth is not only what is added, but also what is lost. Jung once said, "The dream is a little hidden door in the priane, innermost and most secret recesses of the soul." Like dreams, myths never appear randomly. They always carry traces of something real. But when retold, they no longer keep their original form. They transform, they distort, they simplify to fit the understanding of the storyteller. And in that way, a civilization can be translated into another story. A story easier to understand, but no longer accurate. The Minoans may once have been the center, but in Greek stories, they become a challenge, a labyrinth, a monster, something to be overcome. And when that happens, they are not only changed in image, they are changed in position, from center to margin, from subject to object. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize that the way a story is told can shape how the entire past is understood, not by erasing truth, but by telling it differently. And perhaps that is the deepest part, that what remains is not always what once existed, but what has been retold, how a civilization is erased. And then, when you look back at the whole journey, something begins to become clear. They did not disappear in a single day. There was no single moment when everything ended, no final collapse recorded as a full stop. Instead, they disappeared in another way, slower, more subtle, harder to see, not through destruction, but through change. And if you look deeply into that process, you may begin to see a pattern, a way that a civilization is gradually erased, not from the world, but from memory. First, language. When a script is no longer understood, the entire world it carries begins to fade. No one can read their thoughts anymore. No one can hear them speak. And in that way, they lose their voice. Then, leadership. A new system appears. New people take old positions, but bring different perspectives, different structures, different ways of defining the world. And gradually, what once operated the old system is no longer there, not erased immediately, but replaced. Then, the story. When a civilization can no longer tell its own story, others will tell it instead. And those stories are not wrong, but they are no longer theirs. They reflect how the storyteller understands the proper world, not how that world truly was. In the way Carl Gustav Jung suggested, consciousness always interprets what it cannot directly grasp, and in doing so, it transforms, simplifies, restructure, and finally, dissolution. No clear boundary between the old and the new. No point where you can say, this is where they ended, because they do not end. They become part of something else, hidden within it, dissolved into it, no longer recognizable, yet still present. Jung once said, in all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order. In all disorder, there is a hidden order, and perhaps the disappearance of a civilization follows such an order, not random, but a process where nothing is fully erased, but is rewritten in another language, another system, another way of understanding. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize that being erased is not the same as no longer existing. It is no longer being recognized as oneself, no longer called by the old name, no longer understood in the old way. And in that way, they are still here, but no longer themselves, like a memory, changed over time, not gone, but no longer as it was. And perhaps that is what makes this story so deep, that what we call history is not only what happened, but what remains after it has been retold. And as you stay a little longer with the idea that erased equals rewritten, something gentle, yet profound, begins to emerge. That disappearance is not always absence. Sometimes it is another form of presence, a way of existing no longer recognized. Jung once said, "What you resist persists." What is no longer on the surface does not mean it is gone. It simply moves deeper, and from there continues to influence. A civilization erased in this way no longer exists as a separate entity, but it still lives in what comes after, in ideas that remain, in images that repeat, in structures whose origins are forgotten, and in that way, they do not truly disappear. They simply become invisible, no longer named, but still present. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize this is not only the story of history, but a pattern, a way that all things gradually change, not by ending, but by becoming something else, a quiet legacy. And then, after all that has changed, after a civilization is no longer named, no longer tells its own story, something still remains. Not loud, not clear, not easy to see, but still present, like an echo, remaining after the sound has faded. The Minoans may have disappeared from the surface of history, but they have not disappeared from what came after. You can see them in art, soft lines, living movements, images of nature still appearing, no longer carrying their name, but carrying their feeling. You can feel them in religion, symbols of goddesses, rituals tied to cycles of life. What nurtures continues to exist, not the same as before, but not entirely different. You can see them in trade, in how routes continue, in how connections between lands keep developing. Flows do not stop, they simply change form, and you may recognize them in architecture, open spaces, structures not entirely closed, ways of organizing, not only for power, but for flow. All of this does not appear from nothing. It comes from somewhere, a foundation, a deeper layer. In the way Carl Gustav Jung described, there are parts of the mind, not in consciousness, yet still shaping how we think, how we feel, how we act. He called this the unconscious, and perhaps the Minoans have become a kind of unconscious of history, no longer clearly seen, no longer named, but still present in what we do, in what we create, in what we continue, without knowing why. Jung once said, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." What lies beneath the surface is not only what is forgotten, but also the source of creation, of renewal, of what continues to grow. And in that way, the legacy of the Minoans is not in what they clearly left behind, but in what continues quietly, without needing recognition, without needing to be named, simply existing. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize that some things do not need to be seen to have influence, do not need to be named to continue existing, do not need to be remembered to become a foundation. And perhaps that is how the deepest things always endure, not on the surface, but beneath, holding everything in motion. And as you remain a little longer with this idea of a quiet legacy, something very gentle, yet very deep, begins to appear. That what truly endures is not always what is most visible, not what is most recorded, not what is most often mentioned, but what becomes part of the structure, part of the foundation, part of how things function, without needing attention. Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." What is deepest is not on the surface, but within. And in the same way, a civilization does not need to remain as a separate entity to continue influencing. It only needs what it created to be absorbed, preserved, continued in new forms. The Minoans may no longer have a name, no longer a voice, no longer a place in the main narrative, but they are still there, in what has been built upon them. And in that way, they are not the past, but part of the present, part of what is still unfolding, even if no one notices, the unresolved mystery. After all that we have traced, the remaining traces, what has been retold, what has been altered, something still remains. A space, not a lack, but an unopened door. We do not know what they called themselves, We do not know the name they used when speaking of who they were. We do not know the sounds once spoken in their daily lives. Their language is still there, present, but not understood. The symbols remain on clay tablets, but their meaning remains locked. And it is not only language, we also do not truly know how they organized their society, who made decisions, how power was distributed. What we see is only the outer structure. What we do not see is how it truly functioned. And if you pause for a moment, you may feel something very deep, that even though we know so much, we do not truly understand them, not because they left no traces, but because we do not have the key. In the way Carl Gustav Jung once suggested, the unknown is not only what has not yet been discovered, but what lies beyond our current capacity to perceive. And perhaps the Minoans exist at that very boundary, not entirely gone, but not fully present, a state in between, like a dream you remember in fragments, but cannot fully piece together. You know it has meaning. You feel something profound within it, but you cannot name it, cannot explain it. And within that incompleteness, something very special happens. The mystery remains, not fully explained, not closed, but continuing, open. Jung once said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious." What is most beautiful is not what we fully understand, but what remains hidden, still unfolding, still inviting. And perhaps the Minoans are not only a lost civilization, but a question without an answer, a question that still exists, not only in history, but in the way we understand the world. Because when we face something that cannot be fully decoded, we begin to see our limits, the limits of language, the limits of thought, the limits of knowing. And in that moment, a space opens, a space of curiosity, of listening, of accepting that not everything needs to be explained. And if you remain with that feeling, very gently, you may realize that sometimes what is most profound is not the answer, but the question that remains. And as you stay a little longer with what is undeciphered, something very subtle begins to emerge, that there are things, not because we lack data, but because they cannot be understood in the usual way. Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Some truths are not outside, not in what can be measured, not in what can be fully decoded, but in how we approach them. The Minoans may never be fully understood in the scientific sense. We may continue to study, to excavate, to analyze, but there will always be something beyond reach, and perhaps that is not a flaw, but a reminder that history is not always a complete story, but a picture with spaces that do not need to be filled, only to be seen, to be accepted. And sometimes those very spaces are where imagination and deeper understanding begin. Expansion before the Minoans. And then, just when you feel you have gone far enough, touched the edge of a lost civilization, something else opens. Not forward, but backward, deeper, further, before even what we have spoken of. Before the Minoans, there were others, not familiar names in history books, no cities, no palaces, no writing system, but they existed, Neanderthals, and the earliest modern humans, walking the same world, but in a far more distant time, tens of thousands of years. hundreds of thousands of years, a span of time that imagination can barely hold. No written history, no clearly retold stories, only traces, stone tools, signs of fire, cave paintings, small marks carrying something vast, presence. And if you pause for a moment, you may feel something very deep. That civilization did not begin where we think, not with Greece, not with the Minoans, but long before that, not in the form of cities, but in the form of experience. The earliest humans also looked up at the sky, also felt the darkness, also faced life and death, also asked questions, also searched for meaning. In the way Carl Gustav Jung described, there are images, symbols that do not belong to any one moment, but to all humanity, archetypes that appear again and again, across time, across cultures, across forms, yet carrying the same core. And if that is true, then civilization is not only what we build outside, but what we carry within, a deep civilization, not written in words, not built in stone, but preserved in how humans feel the world, in how we respond, in how we search for meaning. And in that way, the Minoans are not the beginning. They are simply a layer, a level within something far deeper, a structure stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize that history is not a straight line, not a sequence of events, but a depth, a space with many layers, some clear, some fading, some almost invisible, yet all are there, and you are part of that structure, not only living in the present, but carrying traces of everything before, in your body, in your mind, in reactions you do not fully understand. Jung once said, "In each of us there is another whom we do I not know." Within each person there is a part unknown to us, and perhaps part of that deep civilization resides there, not as a clear memory, but as a feeling, an intuition, something familiar, yet unnamed. And if you stay with that feeling, very gently, you may realize that this story is not only about the past, but about you, about what you carry from long before you were born. And as you remain longer with this idea of a deep civilization, something vast still begins to open. That what we call a beginning may only be the point where we start to see, not where everything truly began. Jung once said, "The deeper layers of the psyche lose their individual uniqueness as they retreat farther and farther into darkness. The deeper we go into the psyche, the individual fades, and what remains becomes shared, universal." And perhaps human history is the same. The deeper we go, the fewer boundaries, the fewer names, the fewer distinctions. The Minoans, the Neanderthals, modern humans, all begin to merge into something larger, a current no longer belonging to one civilization, but to all humanity. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize that you do not stand apart from this story. You are part of it, not only of the present, but of a depth stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. And perhaps that makes everything feel smaller, and at the same time, deeply meaningful, the uncomfortable truth. And then, as you have moved through this entire journey, from what is clear to what slowly fades, to what can almost no longer be touched, something begins to settle. Not an answer, but a realization, very gentle, very deep, that history is not everything that has happened, but what remains, what is preserved, what can be understood. And if you pause for a moment, you may notice something difficult to accept. What we know is only a part, a very small part, like the tip of an iceberg, visible, clear, easy to see, but beneath is a vast mass, hidden, silent, untold, unrecorded, ununderstood. In the way Carl Gustav Jung once described, consciousness is only a small part of the mind, the part we are aware of, the part we can name, but beneath is the unconscious, a far greater space, holding what is unseen, unrecognized, yet still influential. And perhaps history is the same. What we learn, what is written in books, what is retold, is only the conscious of history. Beneath it is a vast, unconscious, civilizations without names, people without clear traces, stories never told. And if this is true, then a quiet truth, yet a deep one, begins to appear. What exists is not everything. What remains is not the most important, because what remains is not always what was greatest, not always what was deepest, but only what could endure through time, what fits within the way history is recorded. What was not lost, but how many things once existed that are no longer here? How many civilizations have lived, have grown, have disappeared, without leaving traces clear enough to be remembered? And if you feel this slowly, you may realize that history is not a complete picture, but a fragment, a selected part, a surviving part, and within that part, we try to understand the whole. Jung once said man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health. Perhaps not knowing is also necessary, a part that keeps us searching, questioning, listening, not to have every answer, but to remain within the journey. And if you stay with this feeling, very gently, you may realize that this story does not end with a conclusion, but with an open space, a place where you may ask, how many things have existed that we do not know? And within yourself, how many things are present that you have not yet seen? And as you remain a little longer with this uncomfortable truth, that what we know is only the surface, something very still, very deep, begins to spread. That perhaps what matters most is not knowing more, but seeing differently. Jung once said, "We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are." What we call history is not only what has happened, but how we look at what remains, a way of seeing, always limited by language, by time, by the structure of the mind itself. And if this is true, then perhaps history is not an exact record, but an interpretation, a way of understanding, a version, and beneath all those versions, something still remains, unchanged, not entirely rewritten, not dependent on what we call it, a deeper current, more silent, more continuous. And if you feel this slowly, you may realize that perhaps what matters most is not holding the entire story, but realizing that the story is always greater than us and will always extend beyond what we can understand. And then, as the story gently comes to a close, not with a full stop, but with a quiet pause, you may feel something very soft, not the feeling of having understood everything, but the feeling of having touched something deeper, something that does not need a name. We have moved through a civilization that has disappeared, but perhaps what we have truly touched is not them, but the way things exist and then change, The way something can be vast, alive, meaningful, and still gradually dissolve into silence, not because it has no meaning, but because it is no longer named. In the way Carl Gustav Jung once said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Perhaps what is most profound is not holding on to everything, but understanding that everything changes, transforms, becomes something else. The Minoans may no longer exist as a civilization, but they are still there. In what came after, in what was preserved, in what continues without being noticed. And if you listen very gently, you may realize that this is not only true of history, but also of you. There are parts of you that have changed, that are no longer as they once were. Old thoughts, old feelings, old versions of yourself. They have not completely disappeared. They have simply become a foundation, a part of who you are today, no longer clear, but still present. And perhaps that is how everything continues, not by remaining the same, but by transforming, gently, quietly, without needing to be noticed, simply continuing. And as you lie there, listening to this story, perhaps you are also feeling something very still, that there is no need to understand everything, no need to hold on to everything, no need to have all the answers, only to be here, in this moment, in this quiet, in the soft, slow rhythm of your breath, like the way time has passed over thousands of years, unhurried, silent, simply continuing. And now, as the story gently fades, you may allow yourself to relax. No more thinking, no more trying to understand. Just rest. Let everything drift naturally, like waves touching the shore and receding softly, slowly. And if you feel your mind beginning to quiet, this is the moment when you may gently drift into sleep, a deep sleep, peaceful and safe, as if you were floating in a calm ocean. Nothing to do, nothing to hold, only rest. Wishing you a deep sleep, a peaceful sleep, and a gentle night. And if you would like to continue journeys like this, gentle, deep, stories that help you relax before sleep, remember to subscribe to the channel Stories for Sleep, so that each night you always have a story waiting for you to return. Sleep well.